Hello YouTube, Mr. Mags here. In my last video, I created a new dark type gym leader for every single Pokemon region. I had a lot of fun making that video, so I thought I would continue this series. And I figured the best way to go about doing it would be essentially going in reverse order based on how many regions have any given type of gym. So for example, the dark type only has one region that has a dark type gym leader. So I figured the next would be one of the ones that has only two gym leaders. There's actually a multi-way tie. I think it's four types that have only two regions that have gyms of their typing. So I figured the next one I would do would be the type that has been introduced the most recently, that being the fairy type. So sit back, relax, enjoy my presentation where I give every single region a new fairy type gym. Okay, so here's my presentation where I'll be giving a new fairy type gym leader for every single Pokemon region. So starting off is just the criteria for how I develop these teams. First, every gym leader team and position will be chosen based off the fairy types native to the region. So essentially, I wanted to make choices with where these gym leaders were positioned within the region. It would be pretty easy to just say, oh, here are the 4 or 5 best fairy types in the region. That's the eighth gym. You can kind of work your way backwards from there. But instead, I wanted to be a little more creative with where I personally think, given the fairy types that are in this region, where I feel would be best for that fairy type gym leader to be. Some will be the eighth gym, but most of them will not just be the strongest fairy type as the eighth, and you'll see more of my thought process as we go through the picks here. Next up, all the regions are assumed to have modern types and mechanics. Obviously, the fairy typing didn't exist until Generation 6, so unless there was a remake, and not every single region will technically have the fairy typing. So we're assuming that places like Johto and Unova do have fairy type options. And I will not be reusing any aces of any canon fairy type gym leaders or Elite Four members in the region in question unless necessary. Now, for the purposes of this presentation, Opal will be the only fairy type gym leader from Galar. Beatty, Bede, however you say the mean rival from those games, he will not be considered a gym leader because you never really fight him in the capacity as a gym leader. He's stated to become a gym leader, but you never really fight him as a gym leader. So I feel just to give myself more options and just be a little more creative with it, I feel like he should be just considered a rival character because Pokemon from all other major trainers are fair game. So rivals, villain teams, even other gym leaders and Elite Four members that have other fairy types, those are fair game. And this is essentially just kind of forcing me to be a little more creative with this, but also future proofing for future videos where we'll get something like the electric gym, which will probably be the last in the series since almost every single region had an electric type gym leader. It'll be kind of forcing me to choose Pokemon that aren't already aces of gym leaders just to have a little more variety. And lastly, gym leaders' overall strength will be based on the canon gym leaders of the region in question, if not a little stronger. So, for example, the fourth gym from Kanto, I'll be basing it based on Erica's overall strength and kind of going from there. But also something like Kalos, where you know throughout the entire region, they only capped at only 3 Pokemon each, and just those gym leaders weren't really that impressive. The teams I'll be creating here will be a little stronger than those teams in those games. And again, that'll kind of go on a case by case basis. So let's jump right into what I believe would be the best fairy gym for the Kanto region. And I personally think the fourth gym in Kanto makes the most sense. I believe the only fairy types available in Kanto are the Wigglytuff Lime, Mr. Mime, and Clefable. Obviously, Clefable is, the original fairy type. Um, uh, Wigglytuff. I honestly thought Wigglytuff and Clefable had closer base stat totals than they do. Um, but I kind of originally had the idea of putting them at fourth gym to have Clefable and Wigglytuff kind of mirror Erica's Vileplume and Victory Bell, where they're both on the same level and kind of dual aces. But no, Clefable is significantly stronger than Wigglytuff. Wigglytuff only has higher HP, whereas Clefable has better in pretty much every other stat. It also just has, better moveset, just gives the essence of fairy, just a little better. Um, yeah, I like this team a lot. I think any higher than fourth might be a little too weak for that point, and definitely any weaker. I originally kind of had the idea of having Mr. Mime be the ace and have Jigglypuff and Clefairy also on that team, but no, Clefable absolutely needs to be the ace here, and I think around the fourth gym feels right for that. And the little avatar I'm using for each of these gym cards is essentially the NPC trainer model that I felt represented the type best for each region. So this is one of the last characters from Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. I just felt like her design just felt best for the fairy typing. Moving on to Johto, we have, I think, the Johto one should be the third gym with Togetic, Azumarill, and Granbull. And for some reason, I just felt like this guy here just looked like he would be the best candidate for having a Granbull. So yeah, there you go. Um, I kind of flip-flop between him being the third and fourth gym. I could kind of maybe see Azumarill being a little too strong for the third gym, especially if it did have huge power. But considering just how weak Togetic is, yes, it's very specially defensive, but it's all of its other stats are really bad. And Granbull, although it has incredibly high attack power, it's not very fast and it's not really nearly as bulky as Miltank. So I think around the third gym is a nice kind of average for this team here. It might not technically be as oppressive as her Miltank, but I think as a whole, it could still be a pretty good challenge for this point in the game. And then any point after that would be a little underwhelming. If you wanted to put him in the fourth gym, I think you would have to add another Pokemon, that being either really tough or Clefable. But we already used them in the previous gym, and this team represents this region the best, I think. Moving on to Hoenn, I think Hoenn is actually best for the second gym. Obviously, I originally was theory crafting putting Gardevoir as the ace somewhere around the fifth gym. But by that point, I felt like Mawile and Azumarill just wouldn't really be that great uh, as other gym Pokemon. So I essentially wanted to downscale it a little bit. Gardevoir will get its due in a much later video when we hit Psychic types. It will absolutely be the ace of the Psychic gym leader. But in this case, I think Mawile would be a pretty decent ace for a second gym leader. Steel and Fairy is a fantastic typing. It's actually one of, if not the best defensive typings in the entire game, and also really good offensively. And Mawile's stats they're not, the best, but they're also, I think, pretty good for this point in the game. And then, especially if this Azumarill has thick fat and not huge power, I could see it maybe being a bit too strong for the second gym if it had huge power, but if it had thick fat, I think it could be fine. Or if it was a Marill with huge power, I think that'd also be fine. But Curlia being the second one, but also I think that's a good spot for Curlia to be. Again, any future gyms would just Curlia would feel a little underpowered for that point. And I do completely acknowledge that in Gen 3, at this point where, let's assume it'd be around the point where Brawley actually is, Azumarill and Curlia will both technically be under leveled, but you can get around this for two ways. One, you can either say that these Pokemon are just under leveled, gym leaders can be allowed to have under leveled Pokemon sometimes, or you can just add more trainers kind of around him to facilitate this, this increase in levels. Let's say the Mallwell's around 21, 20, 20, 21, 22, and then the others are either 19 or 20. You can either add more trainers on the beach above Dewford Town. You can add more in Granite Cave, which is actually none in Granite Cave, or you can just say, oh, because this gym is actually optional, you can come back once you get stronger. So yeah, I think this is a decent place for a second gym for Hoenn. Moving on to Sinnoh, we have it be the sixth gym, so replacing Byron, Clefable, Mr. Mime, Togekiss. There's surprisingly not as many fairy types in this gen as I thought there would be. The only other option I believe would be Azumarill, and I didn't want to have three different Azumarills in a row. Obviously, it made sense for the Gen 2 and 3 gyms to have Azumarill since Pokemon from their line are from that region. Azumarill evolves into Azumarill, and obviously Azumarill is from Gen 2. But here it just I didn't feel like it makes sense for Azumarill to be here. Um, but considering just how important Mount Coronet is to this region, and Clefairy are found all over that mountain. Mr. Mime evolves from Mime Jr., who is from this game, and then Togekiss is obviously the best fairy type from this generation. I think this is a very solid sixth gym leader. Moving on to Unova. Unfortunately, we do not have a lot of options for Unova fairy types. Literally, these are all the fairy types that could possibly be in this game. Jigglypuff, Azumarill, Whimsicott. I didn't really want to give her another Azumarill. I already, did that twice, and even Jigglypuff I feel is a little boring at this point. So essentially, what I decided is this is if it has to be all fairy types. And this is the team if you can be a little more creative with it. I think lore-wise, it could be a lot of fun to essentially say this gym leader was a normal type gym leader in the past. But once the fairy typing was discovered, she she pivoted to being a fairy type gym leader. And I guess I should have explained this is using the Black and White 2 Pokedex because otherwise it would literally just be Whimsicott. So yeah, like if it were just black and white, it would either have to just be Whimsicott or have to be Audino and Whimsicott, and even then Audino was not a fairy type. So using the black and white 2 Pokedex, Jigglypuff, a normal type Audino, but it looks like it should be fairy. It mega evolves into a fairy type later on. And then obviously Whimsicott being the one native fairy type to the region. I think this can work for a third gym in this region. I am very okay with gym leaders and Elite Four members and whatever not having Pokemon of their type if that Pokemon fits their theming very well. For example, Aaron's Drapion, it looks like a bug type, it evolved from a bug type. It fits him very well. Whereas Venomoth, I don't know why that's on Sabrina's team. But Audino, especially with the lore I'm creating here, I think worked well on her team. And I think every single Unova gym leader should have a type boosting gym of their type. I firmly believe that if Game Freak had decided to start implementing like battle mechanics earlier on, they absolutely would have given every single gym leader ace the type boosting gym. So when this Whimsicott uses Fairy Wind or Dazzling Gleam or whatever fairy move it uses, it'll then be boosted by the gym the first time it uses it. Moving on to Kalos, the one that actually introduced the fairy typing. I think they actually got it right. I think the sixth gym is actually the best place for the fairy typing in this gen. However, I understand why they did it to an extent. I understand they wanted to showcase, these other Pokemon that were then given the fairy typing, but there are so many good and just a good variety of types of fairy types in this gen that I wanted to highlight as many as possible. And I think given this team of Dedenne, Klefki, Carbink, and Florges, I think that's a very good sixth gen. They all have different secondary typings. They can all they all can just do very different things. Dedenne can, mess you up by nuzzling you and just is honestly kind of deceptively bulky. Klefki is then immune to poison types, which is kind of the main weakness of Fairy. Actually, is not weak to steel either. Carbink is also not weak to poison, but is super weak to steel, but it is super defensive. They could probably aren't knocking out in one hit. And then Floor just I always felt was the obvious gym leader ace. I understand Sylveon, like I completely understand why that's there as the ace, but I think Floor just screams ace material to me. So I think this is a very good sixth gym. However, I might not do this every time, but most of the time during this series, when I'm going over the Kalos gym leader, I'm gonna try my best to also make one that has a mega evolution. I personally feel everything from the seventh gen on should have a mega stone. Maybe you can maybe even get away with the sixth gym having one. So I also created a eighth gym leader from this region, that being Aromatisse, Slurpuff, Carbink, Mega Mawile, and Florges. I could easily hear an argument of this actually being too strong. Mega Mawile is ridiculous. Um, but Aromatisse and Slurpuff, they're not the best. They can be kind of tanky, but they can't unless you set up with the egg move, belly drum. Neither of them can really hit you very hard. And then Carbink, yeah, it can tank hits all day, but it again can't really hit very hard, especially since body press didn't exist back then. So I think even though this is just a very good set of five Pokemon, this could easily be Elite Four tier, level of trainer. I think it could also easily work as a eighth gym leader. Moving on to Alola. Now, Alola doesn't typically have gym leaders, so this isn't really based on anything specific. It's just kind of based on how the other regions are structured. I think the level of, I kind of approximated the levels of these of what I believe the gym leaders would have been. So because of that, I think the Alolan Fairy type would be the fifth gym leader, having an Alolan Ninetales, a Shiinotic, a Ribombee, and a Comfey as the ace. I think Comfey just represents the region the best. Ribombee probably represents the fairy typing the best. It definitely, I think, outside of maybe Clefable, is a Pokemon that just looks the most like a fairy or a pixie or some kind of magical creature in that in that space. Um, but I think Comfey just represents the region the best. I originally thought about putting Mimikyu on here instead of either Shiinotic or Alola Ninetales, but Mimikyu will get his due in the Ghost video, and also I think this team just represents not only the region, but also, I don't know, in this specific instance, I was kind of basing it more so off of the character model I picked. I just didn't think she would have a Mimikyu. So plus I think Mimikyu is kind of that level of strength where, especially with its disguise ability, I wouldn't feel good about the fifth gym having a Mimikyu having more than three Pokemon, and I wanted Ninetales and Shiinotic here, so or at least one of them, but I wasn't going to get rid of a Bombi or a Comfey, so all four of them here, and like I said, Mimikyu will get his due later. Moving on to Galar. I Given the fairy types that are available, and I completely understand why they didn't do this because all these fairy types were already used. I just think it makes perfect sense for the Galar gym leader fairy type to be the eighth gym with a Galarian Rapidash, Galarian Weezing, Grimmsnarl, and Gmax Hatterene. Like all of these Pokemon are used either on I'll call them Bede, Opal, and Marnie's team, but since I'm essentially creating this in a vacuum outside of those, their teams kind of come together perfectly to make what I believe is a very powerful eighth gym leader. None of these Pokemon get to the same base stat total as Duraludon from that game, but both Grimmsnarl and Hatterene both have 510 base stat total. Weezing and Rapidash are both high 400s in their own right. So I think this is just a very good eighth gym leader. And One little thing I maybe was cheating a little bit by making the character model one of the junior trainers from Opal's gym, but you know, this model fits the best fairy type the best, so I'm sticking with it. And lastly, we have Paldea. So I think the Paldea fairy type gym should be the third gym with a Tinkatuff Mimikyu. Like I said, not only will it get its due in the Ghost gym video, but I think it makes sense here as well. And then Dots Bun. And with the Paldea gyms in all these videos, I'm essentially going to be, generally speaking, creating three different teams representing the three different kinds of Terra typing that they use in game. The first one representing, uh, if their ace is a fairy type that then tears into a fairy type that, therefore makes their fairy moves that much stronger. One where their ace is a fairy type that tears into a different typing that helps them defensively or offensively, depending. And then a third one where their ace is a Pokemon that's not typically a fairy type, but will Terra into a fairy type. So this first one, her dot spun becomes a fairy type. This next one, her dot spun becomes a steel type, which I think would really help defensively against the uh, poison and steel typings that you would typically send into a fairy gym. And funnily enough, if Dotspun did tear into a steel type, none of the Pokemon on her team would be weak to steel or fairy, or sorry, well, actually, yeah, but steel or poison. So Tough would be immune to steel, not sorry, immune to poison, and not weak to steel. Mimikyu, because of his ghost typing, wouldn't be weak to poison. It would be weak to steel, actually. I did kind of mess up with that one, but still not weak to poison. And then Dotspun wouldn't be weak to either. And actually, it would be immune to one of its other weaknesses, that being fire with its well-baked body ability. So really, its only weakness, as far as what you would typically go into a fairy type gym leader with, would be ground, because you wouldn't think to bring any fighting moves into a fairy gym. So unless you have some ground type moves going, that Doxbud might be pretty hard to take down. And lastly, for the one that has a Pokemon that tears into a fairy type, I think that should be the seventh gym. You evolve the Tinka Tough into a Tinkaton, keep the Mimikyu and Dotspun, and then have her ace be a Blissey. I think a lot of people in their head, if they're not like super aware of, of what's going on, I think a lot of people kind of assume that Blissey actually is already a fairy type. It gives a very similar vibe to Clefable and Wigglytuff, and you would kind of assume that during that same time they would switch Blissey and or Audino into a fairy type, but honestly, actually neither of them outside of Omega Audino became a fairy type. So just like in my last video um where the Pokemon here was a Luxray that heralded to a dark typing, this is their chance to not going to say correct that, because it makes a lot of sense uh why they kept Blissey this way, but um just as far as fan speculation is concerned, fix it so that now Blissey can actually be a fairy type. And I think this works very well. Okay. Thank you so much for watching. Please let me know your thoughts down below about any of these teams here. Let me know if you think I missed anything. Did you disagree with any of my choices? Like I said, specifically for the third gym, I could easily hear people, or third gen, I could easily hear people argue that Gardevoir absolutely should be the ace of that fairy gem. Um, but yeah, any thoughts you have down below? Do you think any of them were too early, not strong enough for where they were, too strong for where they are, etc.? Any Pokemon that I just completely forgot about, or just if you have any, just thoughts about the structure of these videos in general, because like I said, I plan on making 18 of these, for one for every single type. So any feedback you have would be greatly appreciated. So with all that, I will see you all next time.